Good stories for great birthdays. Arranged for storytelling and reading aloud and for the children's own reading. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brianna. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Francis Jenkins Olcott. One in whose eyes the smile of kindness made its haunt, like flowers by sunny brooks in May, yet the thought of others' pain, a shade of sweeter sadness chased the smile away. William Cullen Bryant. Forward. Here are over 200 stories celebrating 23 great birthdays of patriot founders and upbuilders of the republics of both North and South America. In the stories are more than 75 historical characters, men, women, and children. The arrangement follows the school year, beginning in October with Columbus. The book cover is dressed in George Washington's color, scarlet and white. Treatment of history for children. These tales are not packed full of dry facts and dates, boring to children. Instead, they treat history in a manner appealing to boys and girls. For it is the strong personalities that moved in the big events of the world. It is the forceful lives of the men themselves, their preparation in boyhood for successful careers, their struggles for right, their heroism, devotion, and high adventure, as well as why and wherefore of things, which make history an intense reality to children and young folk. American history treated after such a fashion may be used educationally to develop a fine, true type of Americanism. So most of the tales presented here are ones of personality, human and alive. They are full of action, many of them related deeds of courage, kindness, self-sacrifice and perseverance. They are of just the right length to read aloud or tell without fatiguing the children. They deal scarcely at all with battle, murder, or sudden death. They stress the intimate human side of our patriots, the side not often found in textbooks. Some of our heroes. Here are stories of Washington, Hamilton, John Adams, and John Marshall, showing them not cold and wooden, but warm and vital. Also tales of great-hearted Lincoln and of America's very human hero, Roosevelt. And exceedingly human, too, are Light Horse Harry, the Sage of Monticello, Old Hickory, Brother Jonathan, Old Butt, and the Great Commoner, who with words as powerful as sword strokes fought America's battles. Among the women, the mothers and wives helping to win the wars for independence in both North and South America, are Mary and Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, Andrew Jackson's mother, and the mother of John Marshall, the wife of San Martin. And the children of our foreign born, with how much greater pride may they say, "We are Americans," when they read about Lafayette, Kosciuszko, Steuben, Heinz Solomon, Pulaski, DeKalb, the Irish malt pitcher. Then, of course, Columbus, the Italian, is here, sailing under the gold and crimson banner of Spain. Our school children, too, may be surprised to learn that there are 20 robust American republics to the south of us, with aspirations like our own, and having devoted patriots. Among their national heroes are Miranda, the flaming son of liberty; San Martin, the great and good; Bolivar, the brilliant and victorious; O'Higgins, the soldier citizen; and Brazil's patriot Emperor Dom Pedro, the magnanimous. All Spanish accents have been omitted, as is sometimes done in English books, so that the names of South American patriots may not seem strange and foreign to our school children. No historical fiction. There is no historical fiction here. The larger number of stories are original, written purposely for this volume. Every detail is historical, and every conversation is based on an authority. A partial list of the histories and biographies consulted while writing the stories may be found on page 14. When historians have not agreed on the dates and facts, the most reliable sources have been followed. Of the stories attributed to authors, some have been recast to meet requirements of storytelling. Others are given verbatim. This provides a selection of tales varied both in style and in treatment. Some of the tales are for children and some for young people. The book may be useful in all grades. No living Americans are celebrated. Those whose birthdays are kept have passed into history. And since one small volume cannot hold stories about all of our patriots, a careful selection has been made of tales about Americans whose contributions to the founding of free government are of vital importance. It is deeply regretted the lack of space precludes in the use of other birthdays. Because of copyright restrictions, the Roosevelt section is somewhat limited. A number of well-known tales which are omitted may be found in Good Stories for Great Holidays. Teaching American Solidarity. In as far as possible, all tales of sectional differences, of political animosities, and of civil strife have been avoided. The emphasis in this book is upon American solidarity. Pioneers of progress inevitably arouse bitter antagonists. It would require a large volume indeed to treat the derogatory statements and written attacks which have been levelled at most of the men whose birthdays we are celebrating. We know that Columbus suffered severely from attacks by enemies, that Washington was one of the most vilified of men, and that Lincoln's detractors were merciless. Today we may perceive the process of vilification still going on around us. Happily, time has shown that much of the detraction of the past was public slander and clamour, and has consigned it to the rubbish heap of history. In a book of this kind, detractions have little or no place, and it is against the good sense of the best educational principles to impress the children's plastic minds with such matters. When the children are older, they will be better to judge of them intelligently. Helpful to the teachers. May it be said right here with emphasis that this book is not intended to take the place of suitable biographies of men whose birthdays we are celebrating. Entertaining, lively tales should, on the contrary, lead boys and girls to want to know more about their favorite heroes. And the teacher may use these short stories not merely to illustrate American history textbooks, but to strengthen the children's love of country, to teach them the meaning of American unity, and to give them a more intelligent reverence for the Constitution. To add the teacher and storyteller, there is appended on pages 465–483 a subject index, by means of which any sort on a given topic may be quickly found. The study programs on pages 451–462 are chronologically arranged to illustrate the day's lesson. For mothers also, but above all else, may this book, day by day, help mothers and educators to bring to the children's remembrance, on these great birthdays, something of the devotion, the patience, the sufferings, and the personal sacrifice of the noble men, who under the good hand of God laid the foundations of American liberty and self-government. End of foreword. Recording by Brianna.
Chapter number 1 of Good Stories for Great Birthdays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Francis Jenkins Olcott. October 12th, Columbus and Discoverer's Day. The very magnificent Lord Don Cristobal Colon, High Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of the Islands and Terra Firma. Columbus. My men grow mutinous day by day. My men grow ghastly wan and weak. The stout mate thought of home a spray of salt wave washed his swarthy cheek. What shall I say, brave Admiral, say, if we sight naught but seas at dawn? Why you shall say at break of day, sail on, sail on, sail on and on. Then pale and worn he kept his deck, and peered through darkness. Ah, that night of all dark nights! And then a speck, a light, a light, a light, a light. It grew a starlit flag unfurled. It grew to be time's burst of dawn. He gained a world, he gave that world its grandest lesson. On, sail on. From Johann Miller's Columbus. Christopher Columbus was born in Italy about 1451. First landed on the island of America October 12, 1492. Sighted South America 1498. Was sent in chains to Spain 1500. Returned from his fourth voyage 1504. He died May 20th, 1506. His name in Spanish is Cristobal Colon. The Sea of Darkness. Before America was ever heard of, over 400 years ago, a boy lived in Genoa, the proud city. He was just one of hundreds of boys in that beautiful Italian town, whose palaces, marble villas, and churches climbed her picturesque hillsides. The boy's name was Christopher Columbus. Whenever he could leave his father's workshop, where he was learning to comb wool, for his father was a weaver, how eagerly the boy must have run down to the wharves and sat there watching the ships come and go. They came from all these parts of the world which people knew about then, from Iceland and England, from European and Asiatic ports, and from North Africa, caravels, galleys, and galleons, and sailing craft of all kinds, come laden with the wealth that made Genoa one of the richest cities of her time. The sailors, who lounged on the wharves, spun wonderful yarns. They told how beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which guarded the Straits of Gibraltar, there rolled a vast unknown sea, called the Atlantic Ocean, or the Sea of Darkness. No one, they said, had ever crossed it. No one knew what lay beyond it. All was a mystery. And any mariners, the sailors said, who had ventured far out on its black waters had never returned. Fearful things had happened to such mariners, the sailors added, for the Sea of Darkness swarmed with spectres, devils, and imps. And when night fell, slimy monsters crawled and swam in its boiling waves. Among these monsters was an enormous nautilus large enough to crush a whole ship in its squirming arms, and a serpent 50 leagues long with flaming eyes and horse's mane. Sea elephants, sea lions, and sea tigers fed in beds of weeds. Harpies and winged terrors flew over the surface of the water. And horrible, they said, was the fate which overtook the ship of any foolhardy mariners who ventured too far out on that gloomy ocean. A gigantic hand was thrust up through the waves and grasped the ship. A polypus, spouting 2 water spouts as high as the sky, made such a whirlpool that the vessel, spinning round and round like a top, was sucked into the roaring abyss. These frightful sea yarns, and many like them, the sailors told about the Atlantic Ocean, and people believed them. But the eyes of the boy Columbus, as he sat listening, must have sparkled as he longed to explore those mysterious waters of the Sea of Darkness, and follow them to the very edge of the world. For all that lay to the west of the Azores was a great and fascinating mystery when Columbus was a boy, before America was discovered. The Fortunate Isles. Listen now to some of the stories that the Irish sailors who visited Genoa told when Columbus was a boy, and people in those days believed them to be true. They told how far, far in the west, where the sun set in crimson splendor, lay the terrestrial paradise from which Adam and Eve were driven, and other wonder tales the sailors told. One was the enchanting tale of Maelduin, the Celtic knight, who, seeking his father's murderer, sailed over the wide Atlantic in a coracle of skins lapped threefold, one over the other. Many were the wonder islands that Maelduin and his comrades visited: the island of the silvern column, the island of the flaming rampart, the islands of the monstrous ants, and the giant birds, the islands of the fierce beasts, the fiery swine, and the little cat, the islands of the black mourners, the glass bridge, and the spouting water, the islands of the red berries, and the magic apples, and the islands of many other wonders. Many were the strange adventures that Maeldune had in enchanting castles with beautiful queens and lovely damsels, with monstrous birds, sleep-giving potions, and magic food. And the Irish sailors told also of good Saint Brandon, who set sail in a coracle, and discovered the Fortunate Isles. There he dwelt in blessed happiness, they said, and his voice was low as from other worlds, and his eyes were sweet, and his white hair sank to his heels, and his white beard fell to his feet. And still another tale the Irish sailors told, a tale of Fairyland, called the Land of Youth. Thither once went Usheen, the Irish bard. It happened on a sweet misty morning that Usheen saw a slender snow-white steed come pacing along the shore of Erin. Silver were his shoes, and a nodding crest of gold was on his head. Upon his back was seated a fairy maiden crowned with gold, and wrapped in a trailing mantle adorned with stars of red gold. Weirdly but sweetly she smiled, and sang an elfin song, while over sea and shore there fell a dreamy silence. Through the fine mist she urged on her steed, singing sweeter and ever sweeter as she came nearer and nearer to Usheen. She drew rein before him. His friends saw him spring upon the steed, and fold the fairy maiden in his arms. She shook the bridle, which rang forth like a chime of bells, and swiftly they sped over the water and across the sea, the snow-white steed running lightly over the waves. They plunged into a golden haze that shrouded them from mortal eyes. Ghostly towers, castles, and palace gates loomed dimly before Usheen, then melted away. A hornless doe bounded near him, chased by a white hound. They vanished into the haze. Then a fairy damsel rode swiftly past Usheen, holding up a golden apple to him. Fast behind her galloped a horseman, his purple cloak streaming in the air, a sharp sword glittering in his hand. They, too, melted mysteriously away, and soon Usheen himself vanished into the Land of Youth, into Fairyland. These are some of the wonder tales that folk used to tell about the mysterious Atlantic Ocean, when Columbus was a boy. The Absurd Truth. When Columbus was a boy, there was a story that told that the earth was round. Nearly every one who heard it thought it foolish, absurd. "The earth round?" they said. "We do not know that the earth is flat. And does not the sun set each night at the edge of the world?" But young Columbus had a powerful practical imagination. He believed there were good reasons to think that the earth was not flat. He attended the University of Pavia. He studied astronomy and other sciences. He learned map making. He read how the ancient philosophers thought the earth to be a sphere, and how they had tried to prove their theory by observing the sun, moon, and stars. Then, too, there were scholars in Europe, when Columbus was young, who agreed with the philosophers. But no scholar or philosopher had ever risked his life in a frail ship and ventured across the terrible sea of darkness to battle with its horrors and prove his theory to be fact. The surging billows of the Atlantic, with angry leaping crests of foam, still guarded their mystery. Young Columbus became a sailor, cruising with his uncle on the Mediterranean, sometimes chasing pirate ships. When older, he made long voyages. He learned to navigate a vessel. He visited, so some historians say, England and Thule. They say, too, that Thule was Iceland. Then if he visited Iceland, Columbus must have heard the strange tale of how Leif, son of Eric the Red, the bold Northman, sailed in a single ship over the Sea of Darkness and discovered Vinland the Good on the other side of the Atlantic. Columbus talked with sailors about their voyages. He heard how the waves of the Sea of Darkness sometimes cast upon the islands of the Azores giant bamboos, queer trees, strange nuts, seeds, carved logs, and bodies of hideous men with flat faces, the flotsam and jetsam from unknown lands far to the west. Columbus's imagination and spirit of adventure were fired. He became more eager than ever to explore the vast expanse of water, and learn what really lay in the mysterious region, where the sun set each night and from which the sun returned each morning. "The earth is not flat," thought he. "Much goes to prove it. India, from which gold and spices come, is assuredly on the other side. If I can but cross the Sea of Darkness, I shall reach Tartary and Cathay, the gold country of Kublai Khan. I shall have found a western passage to Asia. I will bring back treasure, but more than all else I shall be able to carry the gospel of Christ to the heathen." For Columbus, you must know, was one of the most devout Christian men of his time, and he signed his name to letters, Christ bearing. Christopher in the Greek language meant Christ bearer. Perhaps he was thinking of the beautiful legend of Saint Christopher, who on his mighty shoulders bore the Christ child across the swelling river, even as he, Christopher Columbus, humbly wished to bear Christ's gospel across the raging waters of the Sea of Darkness. Cathay the Golden. Where was Cathay the Golden? Who was Kublai Khan? One of Columbus's favorite books was written by Marco Polo, the great Phoenician traveler, who served Kublai, great Khan of Tartary in Asia. Cathay was the name which Marco Polo gave to China. In his book, Marco Polo told of many marvels. In the chief city of Cathay the Golden, ruled over by Kublai Khan, stood the Grand Khan's palace. Its walls were covered with gold and silver, and adorned with figures of dragons, beasts, and birds. Its lofty roof was colored outside with vermilion, yellow, green, blue, and every other hue, all shining like crystal. To this city of Cathay were brought the most costly articles in the world, gold, silver, precious jewels, spices, and rare silks. The Grand Khan had so many plates, cups, and ewers of gold and silver, that no one would believe it without seeing them. He had 5,000 elephants in magnificent trappings, bearing chests on their back filled with priceless treasure. He had also a vast number of camels with rich housings. At the New Year feast, the people made presents to Kublai Khan of gold, silver, pearls, precious stones, and rich stuffs. They presented him also with many beautiful snow-white horses handsomely caparisoned. These and other wonderful things did Marco Polo write about in his book, and Columbus read them all. At last the time came when Columbus was fully determined to discover a western passage, and thus open a path through the ocean from Europe to Asia. The Spanish courtiers laughed at Columbus. They called him a fool and madman to believe that the Sea of Darkness might be crossed. But as the years of waiting went by, Columbus grew stronger in his determination. The story of his many years of patient but determined waiting in Spain, of his pleadings with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella for money, men, and ships with which to cross the ocean sea, is told in Good Stories for Great Holidays. And in Good Stories for Great Holidays it is told how at last Columbus was befriended by the friar Juan Perez. There also may be found the stories of Columbus and the egg, of his little son Diego at La Rabida, of Queen Isabella pledging her jewels, of Columbus's sailing across the Sea of Darkness, of the mutiny, of his faith, perseverance, and wisdom, and how at last he sighted a cluster of beautiful green islands lying like emeralds in the blue waters of the Atlantic. All these stories may be read in Good Stories for Great Holidays. The Emerald Islands. Columbus's Day, October 12, 1492. It was with songs of praise that Columbus first landed on one of those emerald islands of the New World. And what delightful islands they were, sparkling with streams, and filled with trees of great height. There were fruits, flowers, and honey in abundance. Among the large leaves and bright blossoms, flocks of birds sang and called. There were cultivated fields of Indian corn. And there were savages, naked dark-skinned folk, who peeped from behind trees, or ran frightened away. Later they grew bolder, and traded with Columbus and his men. Some of the savages smoked rolls of dried leaves. This was the first tobacco that white man had ever seen. Thus Columbus and his men discovered Indian corn and tobacco. As Columbus sailed along the shores of the islands, he watched anxiously for the crystal shining domes of Kublai Khan's palace to rise among the trees. But no Cathay the Golden gleamed among the green, no elephants in trappings of cloth of gold paced the sands. Instead, all was wild though so beautiful. The only people were dark-skinned ones, whom Columbus named Indians, for he was sure that he had come across the Sea of Darkness by the western passage to India. The Magnificent Return. It was a day of great rejoicing when Columbus returned to Spain. The whole country rose up to do him honor. Bells were rung, mass was said, and vast crowds cheered him as he passed along streets and highways. No one called him a fool and madman then. Had he not crossed the Sea of Darkness and returned alive? Neither Nautilus, gigantic hand, nor Polypus had dared to harm him. The Sea of Darkness was a mysterious gloomy sea no longer. Instead it was the wide Atlantic Ocean, a safe pathway for brave mariners and good ships, a pathway leading to new lands of gold and spices far toward the setting sun. And so all Spain did honor to Columbus. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella eagerly awaited him at Barcelona. He entered that city with pomp and in procession. Balconies, windows, roofs were thronged. Crowds surged through the streets to gaze in wonder on that strange procession, so spectacular, so magnificent. First came the dark-skinned savage men, in paint and gold ornaments. After them walked men bearing live parrots of every color. Then others came carrying rich glittering coronets and bracelets, together with beautiful fruits and strange vegetables and plants, such as the people of Europe had never dreamed could exist. Then passed the great discoverer himself, Christopher Columbus, a horseback, and surrounded by a cavalcade of the most brilliant courtiers of Spain. He dismounted, and entered the saloon, where the king and queen sat beneath a canopy of brocade. He modestly greeted them on bended knee. They raised him most graciously, and bade him to be seated in their presence. After they had heard his tale with wonder, and had examined the treasures that he had brought with him from beyond the Sea of Darkness, the king and queen together with their whole court knelt in thanksgiving to God. To reward Columbus, his sovereigns bestowed upon him the titles of Don Christopher Columbus, our Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and Viceroy and Governor of the islands discovered in the Indies. They also promised to make him ruler over any other islands and mainland he might discover. Columbus immediately began to prepare for another voyage. With a fleet of 17 ships, bearing supplies and colonists, he sailed across the Sea of Darkness once more to the islands of the New World. He planted a colony there. He discovered other islands, and he still kept on searching diligently for Cathay the Golden. Turbulent adventurers, rapturous gold hunters, and vicious men were among the colonists, and Columbus, in the name of his sovereigns, with great difficulty ruled over them all. The Fatal Pearls. Terra Firme. It was in May 1498. The fleet of Admiral Don Christopher Columbus, in the name of the Holy Trinity, set sail from Spain for a third voyage across the Atlantic. It was no longer a sea of darkness to Columbus, but a sure pathway to golden lands. There he still hoped to find the earthly paradise from which Adam and Eve had been driven. And there, too, he still expected to discover Cathay the Golden in Tartary, and Cipango, the great island of the Western Sea, which we call Japan. His ships sailed on, now plunging through the lifting billows, now lying becalmed on glassy waters, under the fierce rays of the tropic sun, and now moving through a region of balmy airs and light refreshing breezes. July arrived, yet he had not sighted land. The fierce heat of the sun had sprung the seams of the ships. The provisions were rancid. There was scarcely any sweet water left in the casks. The anxious, watchful Admiral scanned the horizon. On the last day of the month came a shout from the masthead, "Land!" And Columbus beheld the peaks of 3 mountains rising from the sea, outlined sharply against the sky. Then he and his men, lifting up their voices, sang anthems of praise and repeated prayers of thanksgiving. As the ships drew nearer to the 3 peaks, Columbus perceived that they rose from an island and were united at their base. "3 in 1," he said, and named the island after the Holy Trinity in whose name he had set sail. For he had vowed before leaving Spain to name the first new land he saw after the Trinity. That is why that island to day is called Trinidad. They filled their casks there. Then onward they sailed, skirting the coast of Trinidad, hoping to find a harbor to put into while repairing the ship. Soon they saw a misty headland opposite the island. "It's another island," said Columbus. It was no island. Wonderful to relate, Columbus had just discovered a new country. It was the coastline of a vast southern continent. It was terra firma. It was South America. The Pearls. Young Indian braves, graceful and handsome, their black hair straight and long, their heads wrapped in brilliant scarves, other bright scarves wound round their middles, came in a canoe to visit Columbus's ships. Soon after this visit, Columbus set sail again, not knowing that he had just sighted one of the richest and greatest continents on earth. Sailing past the mouths of the mighty Orinoco River, pouring out their torrents with angry roar into the Caribbean Sea, Columbus skirted what is now called Venezuela. Other friendly Indians came to his ships. It was then that Columbus saw, for the first time, the pearls which were to help ruin him, and which were to work wretchedness and death for so many poor Indian folk. Among the friendly Indians were some who wore bracelets of lustrous pearls. The gold and spices got by Columbus on his former voyages were of slight beauty compared with those strings of magnificent pearls. Columbus examined them eagerly. He longed for some to send back to Queen Isabella, in order to prove to her what a rich land he had just discovered. He questioned the Indians. Where had they got the pearls? They came from their own land, and from a country to the north and west, they answered. Columbus was eager to go thither. But first he sent men ashore to barter for some of the bracelets. With bright bits of earthenware, with buttons, scissors, and needles, they bought quantities of the pearls from the delightful Indians, to whom such articles were worth more than gold and jewels of which they had plenty. Then Columbus, hoisting sail, ran farther along the coast purchasing pearls until he had half a bushel or so of the luxurious sea jewels, some of them of very large size. He named a great gulf the Gulf of Pearls. He discovered other islands, among them the island of Margarita, which means a pearl. After which he turned his ships towards Santo Domingo, not knowing how tragic a thing was to befall him there, partly on account of the pearls. The Curse of the Pearls. Those fatal sea jewels had already begun their evil work. While Columbus was tarrying to collect them, a rebellion fomented by mad men, who had taken advantage of his absence, had broken out in the island of Santo Domingo. When Columbus reached there, he suppressed it, but his enemies hastened to send lying reports about him to the Spanish court, and the courtiers, who were jealous of his high position, wealth, and power, urged King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to have him deposed. One of their accusations against him was, that he had held back from his sovereigns their rightful portion of the rich find of pearls. So, at last, the royal edict went forth that the very magnificent Don Christopher Columbus, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of the Indies, should be tried and, if found guilty, deposed and returned to Spain. The man sent to do all this, and govern in Columbus's stead, was named Bobadilla. Bobadilla arrived at Santo Domingo with royal commands for Columbus to surrender all power to him, and to obey him in everything. He caused him to be arrested and thrown into prison. He tried and condemned him. He ordered him put into chains. But no one could be found to rivet the chains until One of Columbus's own servants, a shameless and graceless cook, did so with glee. Then Bobadilla reigned in Columbus's place over the Indies. Meanwhile, the grand old admiral, broken in spirit, carped at by his foes, was placed in manacles aboard a caravel. Bobadilla had given orders that the chains should not be removed, but the human master of the ship offered to break them. "Nay," said Columbus with dignity, "my sovereigns have commanded me to submit, and Bobadilla has chained me. I will wear these irons until by royal order they are removed, and I shall keep them as relics and memorials of the reward of my services." But when Queen Isabella learned how he had been brought back to Spain in shackles, she was greatly angered. Both sovereigns commanded that he should be immediately released, and when the venerable Columbus, grown old in her service, entered her presence, Queen Isabella wept bitterly. Columbus fell at her feet, unable to utter a word, so great was his sorrow. Both sovereigns promised to restore all his titles and the wealth which had been taken from him by force. But though Bobadilla was finally deposed from power because of his treatment of Columbus and because of his evil rule, yet the royal promise was not fulfilled. His titles and property were never restored to Columbus. Instead, he was again sent overseas on a fourth voyage of discovery. With 4 miserable caravels manned by only 150 men, the gray-headed, weary Columbus set forth once more, still hoping to discover the country of Kublai Khan, and find the earthly paradise. And this time Columbus took with him his younger son, Ferdinand, who was 13 years old. Queen Isabella's Page. Off to find Kublai Khan, to drink from his golden cups, to eat from his silvern plates, to ride his elephants, to visit in his great palace, and perhaps to discover the earthly paradise. What more thrilling adventure could a boy want? So Ferdinand Columbus, Queen Isabella's page, eager for adventure, set sail with his father Columbus, to cross the Sea of Darkness and explore beyond the Emerald Islands. For, while his father, on his former voyage, had been gathering pearls among the Pearl Islands of the New World, the boy Ferdinand, amid the splendor of the Spanish court, had been waiting upon Queen Isabella. But now, what a change! Ferdinand was off across the heaving, foaming Sea of Darkness in a small caravel, tossed about like a cockleshell on the billows. A tempest with rain, thunder, and lightning arose. It struck Columbus's wretched caravels. They were buffeted by the wind, their sails were torn, their rigging, cables, and boats were lost. Food was washed overboard. The sailors were terrified. They ran about making religious vows and confessing their sins to each other. Even the boldest was pale with fear. "But the distress of my son, who was with me, grieved me to the soul," wrote Columbus afterward, "for he was but 13 years old, and he endured so much toil for so long a time. Our Lord, however, gave him strength to enable him to encourage the rest. He worked as if he had been 80 years at sea." But there was more to trouble plucky Ferdinand than the storm at sea. Columbus, his father, fell sick near to death. There was no one who could direct the ship's course but Columbus himself. So he had a little cabin rigged up on deck. Lying there he gave his orders. presently, to Ferdinand's joy, he grew better. Meanwhile, what was happening to the wicked Bobadilla? The same tempest was doing great things. It was buffeting, lashing, and wrecking a caravel which was taking Bobadilla to Spain. The ship, plunging under the howling, raging, black waters, sank to the bottom of the ocean, taking Bobadilla with it, and the treasure he had stolen from Columbus. But Columbus's own caravels won safely through the storm and across the Caribbean Sea. They drew near to an unknown shore, the coast of Central America. There is not space here in which to tell of the many adventures of Columbus and his men, nor of all the things that Ferdinand saw. There were other storms. At one time, the seas ran high and terrific, foaming like a cauldron. The sky burned like a furnace. The lightning played with such fury that the waves were red like blood. The coast of Central America was thickly peopled with savages. Some of them were richly clothed, and wore ornaments of gold and coral, and carried golden mirrors fastened round their necks. Ferdinand saw other savages in trees, living like wild birds, their huts built on sticks placed across from bough to bough. He saw strange beasts, beautiful birds, delicious fruits, brilliant flowers, great apes, and alligators basking in the rivers. There were fights with natives, a massacre of some of his father's men. There was starvation and misery. Then Columbus, after having sailed down the coast and back again, turned the ships homeward. Then came the most terrible adventure of all. The ships were riddled by worms. Their sides were rotten, and the water was pouring through them like a sieve. Columbus reached the lonely island of Jamaica, just in time to drive his two remaining ships on the beach, and save them from sinking. There for many months Ferdinand was marooned, with his father and the men. There was more starvation, a mutiny, and adventures with savages. Then came the exciting rescue by two caravels. Such were the adventures of Queen Isabella's page. But he went back to Spain without seeing Cathay the Golden and Kublai Khan's palace. The Twin Cities. When Columbus was exploring the coast of Central America, he fell sick of a fever. He had a dream. He tells us of this dream in his own letters. He dreamed that a compassionate voice spoke to him, bidding him believe in God, and serve Him who had him from infancy in His constant and watchful care, and who had chosen him to unlock the barriers of the ocean sea. This voice said many things to Columbus, adding these words: "Even now he partially shows thee the reward of so many toils and dangers incurred by thee in the service of others. Fear not, but trust." And even then, Columbus thought he did not know it, was actually seeing the land where his hopes were to come true. For today, we Americans know that while Columbus was exploring inlets and river mouths on the coast of Central America, searching for the western passage to Asia, he entered Limon Bay of Panama. He even sailed part way up the Chagres River. And if his melancholy eager eyes might have been opened, what a vision he would have had of the future! He would have beheld the Caribbean Sea beating on civilized shores. He would have seen twin cities rising, their pleasant white palm-shaded houses smiling in the sun, the twin cities of Cristobal and Colon, Christopher and Columbus, proud to bear his famous name. He would have seen those twin cities guarding a western passage to Asia. He would have perceived in his vision ships, greater than any Spanish caravels, sliding through a canal the wonder of the world, on their way to and from Asia, the Golden. But as it was, in a miserable little caravel, tempest-racked, with masts sprung and sides worm-eaten, the weary, disappointed Columbus, with the boy Ferdinand, returned at last to Spain. And about 2 years later, in the city of Valladolid, the grand old admiral, who had given a new world to the old, died almost in poverty. As he passed away, he murmured, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The pearls again. The curse of the pearls still held strong after Columbus's death. News of the discovery of the Pearl Islands in the New World spread rapidly through Europe. Many cruel and greedy pearl hunters hastened to set out for the islands. They pillaged the native villages. They hunted the Indians like wild beasts. They forced them to work in the mines. But, worst of all, they made them dive into the deep seas for pearls, under the most horrible conditions. Then it was the compassionate friend of the Indians, the humane priest Bartholomew de las Casas, took up their cause and pleaded for them with the Spanish crown. But Spain was too far away for the crown to control Spanish officials in America, and do much to lessen the sufferings of the natives. Thus sorrow and desolation followed the finding of the sea jewels. In time, they became a rich part of the cargoes of the treasure galleons, and they forged one of the first links in the chain of oppression which bound all Spanish America for over 300 years. For how this chain was broken by the great liberators, read Miranda, The Flaming Sun of Liberty, page 325. San Martin, the Protector, page 235. O'Higgins, First Soldier, First Citizen, page 393. Bolivar, the Liberator, page 371. End of chapter 1. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 2 of Good Stories for Great Birthdays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Francis Jenkins Olcott. October the 14th. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. Quote, "As justice is a preserver, so it is a better procurer of peace than war." End quote. William Penn. Within the land of Penn, the sectary yielded to the citizen, and peaceful dwelt the many-creeded men. Peace brooded over all. No trumpet stung the air to madness, and no steeple flung alarms down from bells at midnight rung. The land slept well. The Indian from his face washed all his war paint off, and in the place of battle marches sped the peaceful chase. The desert blossomed round him, wheat fields rolled beneath the warm wind, waves of green and gold, the planted ear returned its hundredfold. John Greenleaf Whittier. William Penn was born in London, October the 14th, 1644. Received the charter granting him Pennsylvania, 1681. Composed the Plan for the Peace of Europe, 1693. He died in England, May the 30th, 1718. The Boy of Great Tower Hill. In a house on Great Tower Hill, near London Wall, was born William Penn, who was to become the founder of Pennsylvania. He was christened William after his ancestor, Penn of Penn's Lodge. He was a charming baby, with round face, soft blue eyes, and curling hair. His father, Captain Penn, who had been called home to see the new baby on that first birthday of little William Penn, went back to his ship rejoicing that he had such a handsome son and heir. When William Penn was 10 years old, a strange thing befell him. He was not like other boys. He was quiet and serious. At that time he was a schoolboy in an English village. One day he was alone in his room. Suddenly he felt a wonderful peace and an inner comfort, while a glory filled the room. He felt that he was drawn near to God, so that his soul might speak with him. A strange experience for a boy to have. But it was an experience which helped to shape William Penn's life. From that time on, he believed that he had been called to live a holy life. When he grew older, his family tried to make him forget this religious experience, but he never forgot. In time he became a Friend, or Quaker. In those days, Friends were bitterly persecuted in England. William Penn suffered imprisonments and persecutions, but always with patient sweetness and endurance. At last, the persecutions of the Friends made William Penn turn his thoughts toward the new world of America. He wore it as long as he could. When William Penn became a Friend, he did not immediately leave off his gay apparel, as other Friends did. He even wore a sword, as was customary among men of rank and fashion. One day, being with George Fox, the great leader of the Friends, he asked his advice about wearing the sword, saying that it had once been the means of saving his life without injuring his antagonist, and that, moreover, Christ had said, "He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one." "I advise thee," answered George Fox quietly, "to wear it as long as thou canst." Shortly after this they met again. William Penn had no sword. "William," said George Fox, "where is thy sword?" "Oh," replied William Penn, "I have taken thy advice. I wore it as long as I could." Samuel M. Janney, retold. The Peacemaker. "He must not be a man, but a statue of brass or stone, whose bowels do not melt when he beholds the bloody tragedies of this war in Hungary, Germany, Flanders, Ireland, and at sea, the mortality of sickly and languishing camps and navies, and the mighty prey the devouring winds and waves have made upon ships and men," wrote William Penn over 200 years ago. It was then that William Penn became the peacemaker. The world was in the midst of a terrible war. William Penn did not believe in war. He had cast aside his own sword for principle's sake, and had bravely suffered persecutions and imprisonments in the Tower of London and in Newgate. Fearlessly now he came forward with a plan for world peace, which he hoped would stop bloody wars and persuade rulers to arbitrate their quarrels. He published a Plan for the Peace of Europe, urging the formation of a League of European countries. So earnest in this plan, and so profoundly thought out, that it has had much influence on rulers and statesmen, who from time to time have held peace congresses in Europe. But rivalry of nations has prevented the peace plan from ever being carried out. "Christians," urged William Penn, "have imbrued their hands in one another's blood, invoking and interesting all they could the good and merciful God to prosper their arms to their brethren's destruction. Yet their Saviour has told them that he came to save and not to destroy the lives of men, to give and plant peace among men. And if in any sense he may be said to send war, it is the holy war indeed, for it is against the devil and not the persons of men. Of all his titles, this seems the most glorious as well as comfortable for us, that he is the Prince of Peace." Westward ho and away. The time arrived when William Penn's peaceful thoughts went sailing over the Atlantic, westward ho and away, for he was appointed a trustee of Jersey in America. There came to him, while he was still in England, news of immense tracts of land lying beyond Jersey, so fertile that under cultivation they would yield harvests unparalleled in his island home. He heard of rich minerals, of noble forests, of river banks offering splendid sites for towns and cities, of bays where proud navies might ride at anchor. Moreover, many friends who had fled from persecution in England were settled in Jersey. Their industry had already turned the wilderness into a garden. They were holding their meetings and worshipping God without fear of constables and fines, of imprisonments and attacks by mobs. In Jersey they had full liberty of conscience. And William Penn, as his thoughts sailed westward ho and away, saw rising from the sea, bright and fair, a land of refuge not only for persecuted friends, but for all oppressed people. He determined to found a new state in America, where nobody should be persecuted for religion's sake, where everybody should be free, and where the people should govern themselves. A holy experiment, he called it. He presented a petition to Charles II, asking for a royal grant of land near Jersey. After many waitings, watchings, solicitings, the title to a vast tract was confirmed to him under the Great Seal of England. He was to be its ruler and lord proprietor, with large powers and privileges. He was to make laws, grant pardons, and appoint officials as he saw fit, but subject to the approval of the English government. Penn named his land Sylvania, but the king called it Pennsylvania, in honor of old Admiral Penn, William Penn's father. Almost the first thing that Penn did was to write to the people already settled in Pennsylvania a loving address. "My friends," he began, "I wish you all happiness here and hereafter. These are to let you know that it hath pleased God in his providence to cast you within my lot and care. You shall be governed by laws of your own making, and live a free and, if you will, a sober and industrious people." Thus William Penn promised the people of Pennsylvania liberty and the right to govern themselves, and he kept his promises. John Stoughton, retold. The City of Brotherly Love. With what delight did William Penn first set foot on the shores of the Delaware River! It was autumn. The sweet, clear air, the serene skies, the trees, fruits, and flowers filled him with a well-nigh unspeakable joy. And later, while being rowed up the river in a barge, he saw the ancient forest trees on either bank, their leaves flaming with red, gold, and amber. He saw flocks of wild fowl rise up from the water and fly screaming overhead. The solitude and grandeur of the wilderness brooded over all. Meanwhile, farther up the river, a welcome was awaiting him. In a little town, shaded by pine trees and built on a high shore, there were white men and Indians hurrying to and fro. They were preparing an entertainment for William Penn, their governor. The town was Penn's capital city. He had named it Philadelphia, which means brotherly love. And as his barge drew near the City of Brotherly Love, the white settlers, Swedish, Dutch, and English friends, greeted him heartily, for they already knew how just, gentle, and wise he was. As for the Indians, so stately in their robes of fur and nodding plumes, William Penn walked with them and sat down on the ground to eat with them. They gave him hominy and roasted acorns, and after the feast they entertained him with their sports, jumping and hopping. And William Penn sprang up gaily like a boy, and joining in their games, beat them all, young braves and old. And so the red men learned to love and trust their great white father. Onas, they called him, for Onas is Indian for a pen or a quill. Such was William Penn's happy welcome to the City of Brotherly Love. The Place of Kings. It was the last of November. The lofty forest trees on the shore of the Delaware had shed their summer attire. The ground was strewn with leaves. A council fire was burning brightly beneath a huge elm not far from the City of Brotherly Love. It was an ancient elm, which for over 100 years had guarded Shakamaxon, the Place of Kings. For long before the palefaces had landed on the shore of the Delaware, Indian Sachems, king of the Redskins, had held their friendly councils in its shade, and smoked many a pipe of peace. On that November day, the tribes of the Lenni Lenape, under the wide-spreading branches of the elm, were gathered around the council fire. They were seated in a half-circle, like a half-moon. They were all unarmed. Among the chiefs was the great Sachem Taminend, revered for his wisdom and beloved for his goodness. He sat in the middle of the half-moon with his council, the aged and wise, on either hand. They waited. Then, lo, a barge appeared. At its masthead flew the broad pennant of Governor William Penn. The oars were plied with measured strokes, guiding the barge to land, and near the helm sat William Penn, attended by his council. He landed with his people and advanced toward the council fire. A handsome man he was, only 38 years old, athletic and graceful. His manners were courteous, his blue eyes were friendly. He was plainly dressed, with a scarf of sky-blue network bound about his waist. Some of his people preceded him. They carried presents for the Indians, which they laid on the ground before them. Then William Penn approached the council fire. Thereupon the great Sachem Taminend put on a chaplet surmounted by a horn, the emblem of his power, and through an interpreter announced that the nations were ready to hear William Penn. Thus being called upon, William Penn began his speech. "The Great Spirit," he said, "who made me and you, who rules the heavens and the earth, and who knows the innermost thoughts of men, knows that I and my friends have a hearty desire to live in peace and friendship with you, and to serve you to the utmost of our power. It is not our custom to use hostile weapons against our fellow creatures, for which reason we have come unarmed. Our object is not to do injury, and thus provoke the Great Spirit, but to do good. We are met on the broad pathway of good faith and good will, so that no advantage is to be taken on either side, but all to be openness, brotherhood, and love." Here William Penn unrolled a parchment on which was inscribed an agreement for trading, and promises of friendship. He explained the agreement article by article. Then laying the parchment on the ground, he said that that spot should evermore be common to both peoples, pale-face and redskin. The Indians listened to his speech in perfect silence and with deep gravity, and when he was finished speaking, they deliberated together for some time. Then the great Sachem ordered one of his chiefs to address William Penn. The chief advanced, and in Sachem's name saluted him, and taking William Penn by the hand, made a speech pledging kindness and neighborliness, saying that the English and the Lenni Lenape should live together in love, so long as the sun and the moon should endure. Samuel M. Janney, retold. Onas. After the treaty was made at the Place of Kings, the Lenni Lenape for many years enjoyed the mild and just rule of their elder brother Onas. He met them often around the council fire, hearing and rectifying their wrongs, adjusting trade matters, and smoking with them the pipe of peace. And William Penn made treaties with the Indians who dwelt on the Potomac, and with the Five Nations. Thus Pennsylvania had quiet, and the red men were friends of the settlers. Sometimes they brought the white men venison, beans, and maize, and refused to take pay. Whereas in the other colonies the Indians were dangerous neighbors, cruel and delighting in blood. They had been made suspicious and revengeful by the injustice and wickedness of white men. So the red men of Pennsylvania trusted William Penn, although he was a paleface. What paleface had they ever seen like him? A paleface was to them a trapper, a soldier, a pirate, a man who cheated them in barter, who gave them firewater to drink, who hustled them off their hunting ground. But here was one paleface who would not cheat and lie, who would not fire into their lodge, who would not rob them of their beaver skins, who would not take a rood of land from them, till they had fixed and he had paid their price. Where were they to look for such another lord? So when they heard that Onas was about to sail for England, Indians from all parts of Pennsylvania gathered to take sorrowful leave of him. After he was gone, they preserved with care the memory of their treaties with him by means of strings or belts of wampum. Often they gathered together in the woods on some shady spot, and laid their wampum belts on a blanket or a clean piece of bark, and with great satisfaction went over the whole. So great was their reverence and affection for William Penn, inspired by his virtues, that they handed on the memory of his name to their children. When William Penn died in England, the Indians sent his wife a message mourning the loss of their honored brother Onas, and with the message went a present of beautiful skins for a cloak, to protect her while passing through the thorny wilderness without her guide. W. Hepworth Dixon and Other Sources. End of section 2.
Chapter 3 of Good Stories for Great Birthdays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dusty Brailsford. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Francis Jenkins Olcott. October 27. Theodore Roosevelt, America's Hero. On behalf of all our people, on behalf no less of the honest man of means than of the honest man who earns each day's livelihood by that day's sweat of his brow, it is necessary to insist upon honesty in business and politics alike, in all walks of life, in big things and in little things, upon just and fair dealing as between man and man. Theodore Roosevelt. The Square Deal. We of the great modern democracies must strive unceasingly to make our several countries lands in which a poor man who works hard can live comfortably and honestly, and in which a rich man cannot live dishonestly nor in slothful avoidance of duty. And yet, we must judge rich man and poor man alike by a standard which rests on conduct and not on caste. And we must frown with the same stern severity on the mean and vicious envy which hates and would plunder a man because he is well off, and on the brutal and selfish arrogance which looks down on and exploits the man with whom life has gone hard. Theodore Roosevelt. Colonel Theodore Roosevelt was born in New York City, October 27, 1858. Was appointed Police Commissioner of New York City, 1895. Aided in establishing the independence of Cuba, 1898. Was elected Governor of the State of New York, 1898. Served as President of the United States, 1901 to 1909. He died January 6, 1919. The boy who grew strong, not in a log cabin. Theodore Roosevelt, unlike Abraham Lincoln, was not born in a log cabin. On the contrary, he was born to wealth and position in the city of New York. He was reared in an elegant home and educated in one of the famous universities of the country. He read law, but he had no need to practice a profession. His father had retired from business, and there was no occasion for the son to take up a business career. But Theodore Roosevelt preferred for himself a life of toil, the strenuous life. Ill health was the first and greatest of all his disadvantages. When a boy, said he, I was pig-chested and asthmatic. From earliest infancy he was called to battle with asthma. It lowered his vitality and threatened his growth. His body was frail, but within was the conquering spirit. He determined to be strong like other boys. In this he had the loving help of gentle parents. On the wide back porch of their home in the city of New York, they fitted up a gymnasium, where he strove for bodily vigor with all of his might. Although at the start his pole climbing was very poor, he kept trying until he got to the top. He would carry his gymnastic exercises to the perilous verge of the window ledge, more to the alarm of the neighbors than of his own family. In the wide out of doors. Summer was the season of Roosevelt's delight. Then he ceased to be a city boy. At his father's country place on Long Island, he learned to run and ride, row and swim. And when the long sleepless nights came, the father would take his invalid boy in his arms, wrap him up warmly, and drive him in the free open air through 15 or 20 miles of darkness. The boy had his father's love of the woods and the fields. He studied and classified the birds of the neighborhood until he knew their songs and plumage and nests. He and his young friends could be relied on to find the spot where the violets bloomed the earliest, and the trees on which the walnuts were the most plentiful, as well as the pools where the minnows swarmed and the favorite refuge of the coon. He was taken to Europe in the hope that it would benefit his health. A tall, thin lad with bright eyes and legs like pipe stems. When at last he was ready to go to college, he had vanquished his enemy, ill health, and was ready to play a man's part in life. "I made my health what it is," he said later. "I determined to be strong and well and did everything to make myself so. By the time I entered Harvard, I was able to take part in whatever sports I liked. I wrestled and sparred, and I ran a great deal. And, although I never came in first, I got more out of the exercise than those who did, because I immensely enjoyed it and never injured myself." Busting Broncos. After leaving college, young Roosevelt entered politics. Finally, between legislative sessions, he surrendered to his impulses and started for the Wild West. He left the train in North Dakota at the little town of Medora. The young visitor from the East sought out 2 hunters and told them that he wished to go buffalo hunting with them. And he did so, though hunting the buffalo then was no fancy pastime. It was, in truth, a rare chance to see the Wild West in the last glow of its golden age. Soon it was all to vanish and pass into the most romantic chapter of American history. Before his first visit was at an end, he had become a ranchman. The young master of Elkhorn Ranch, brave, outspoken, and always ready to bear his full share of toil and hardship, was not long in winning the respect and hearty goodwill of the bluff, honest men of the Badlands. After only a little experience in ranching, he learned to sit in his saddle and ride his horse like a lifelong plainsman. But he never pretended to any special fondness for a bucking bronco, and a story is told of a trick played on him by some friendly persons in Medora. He was in town, waiting for a train that was to bring a guest from the East. While he was in a store, the jokers placed his saddle on a notoriously vicious beast, which they substituted for his mount. When he came out, in haste to ride around to the railway station, he did not detect the deception. Once he was on the horse's back, the bronco bucked and whirled to the amusement of the grinning villagers. But to their amazement, the young ranchman succeeded in staying on him and spurring him into a run. Away they flew to the prairies, and soon back they raced in a cloud of dust and through the town. The friend from the East arrived and joined the spectators, who waited to see if the young squire of Elkhorn ever would return. In a little while he was seen coming along the road at a gentle gait, and when he reached his starting point, he dismounted, with a smile of quiet mastery, from as meek a creature as ever stood on 4 legs. He had no use, however, for a horse whose spirit ran altogether to ugliness. When he first went west, he doubted the theory of the natives that any horse was hopelessly bad. For instance, there was one in the sod-roofed log stable of Elkhorn who had been labeled the Devil. Roosevelt believed that gentleness would overcome Devil. The boys thought it might, if he should live to be 75. After much patient wooing, Devil actually let Roosevelt lay his hand on him and pat him. The boys began to think that possibly there was something to this new plan of bronco busting. One day, however, when his gentle trainer made bold to saddle and mount him, Devil quickly drew his 4 hoofs together, leaped into the air, and came down with a jerk and a thud. Then he finished with a few fancy curves that landed his disillusioned rider a good many yards in front of him. Roosevelt sprang to his feet and on to the back of the animal. 4 times he was thrown. Finally, the determined rider maneuvered Devil out onto a quicksand where bucking is impossible. And when at last he was driven back to solid earth, he was like a lamb. In this rough life of the range, The young ranchman conquered forever the physical weaknesses of his youth, and put on that rude strength which enabled him to stand before the world a model of vigorous manhood. James Morgan, arranged. Sagamore Hill, his home at Oyster Bay. From Roosevelt's Autobiography. Sagamore Hill takes its name from the old Sagamore Mohannis, who, as chief of his little tribe, signed away his rights to the land 2 centuries and a half ago. The house stands right on the top of the hill, separated by fields and belts of woodland from all other houses, and looks out over the bay and the sound. We see the sun go down beyond long reaches of land and of water. Many birds dwell in the trees round the house or in the pastures and the woods nearby. And of course in winter, gulls, loons, and wildfowl frequent the waters of the bay and the sound. Roosevelt breaking Devil. We love all the seasons, the snows and the bare woods of winter, the rush of growing things and the blossom spray of spring, the yellow grain, the ripening fruits and the tasseled corn, and the deep leafy shades that are heralded by the green dance of summer, and the sharp fall winds that tear the brilliant banners in which the trees greet the dying year. The sound is always lovely. In the summer nights we watch it from the piazza and see the lights of the tall fall river boats as they steam steadily by. Now and then we spend a day on it, the 2 of us together in the light rowing skiff, or perhaps with one of the boys to pull an extra pair of oars. We land for lunch at noon under wind-beaten oaks on the edge of a low bluff, or among the wild plum bushes on a spit of white sand, while the sails of the coasting schooners gleam in the sunlight, and the tolling of the bell buoy comes landward across the waters. Early in April, there is one hillside near us which glows like a tender flame in the white of the bloodroot. About the same time we find the shy mayflower, the trailing arbutus. And although we rarely pick wildflowers, one member of the household always plucks a little bunch of mayflowers to send to a friend working in Panama, whose soul hungers for the northern spring. Then there are shadblow and delicate anemones about the time of the cherry blossoms. The brief glory of the apple orchards follows, and then the thronging dogwoods fill the forests with their radiance. And so flowers follow flowers until the springtime splendor closes with the laurel and the evanescent honey-sweet locust bloom. The late summer flowers follow, the flaunting lilies and the cardinal flowers and marshmallows and pale beech rosemary, and the goldenrod and the asters, when the afternoons shorten and we again begin to think of fires in the wide fireplaces. Theodore Roosevelt. The children of Sagamore Hill. Mrs. Roosevelt looked after the place itself. She supervised the farming, and the flower gardens were her especial care. The children were now growing up, and from the time when they could toddle, they took their place, a very large place, in the life of the home. Roosevelt described the intense satisfaction he had in teaching the boys what his father had taught him. As soon as they were large enough, they rode their horses, they sailed on the cove and out into the sound. They played boys' games, and through him, they learned very young to observe nature. In his college days, he had intended to be a naturalist, and a natural history remained his strongest avocation. And so he taught his children to know the birds and animals, the trees, plants, and flowers of Oyster Bay and its neighborhood. They had their pets. Kermit, one of the boys, carried a pet rat in his pocket. 3 things Roosevelt required of them all: obedience, manliness, and truthfulness. William Roscoe Thayer. Off with John Burroughs. From Roosevelt's Autobiography. One April, I went to Yellowstone Park, where the snow was still very deep, and I took John Burroughs with me. I wished to show him the big game of the park, the wild creatures that have become so astonishingly tame and tolerant of human presence. In the Yellowstone, the animals seemed always to behave as one wishes them to. It is always possible to see the sheep and deer and antelope and also the great herds of elk, which are shyer than the smaller beasts. In April, we found the elk weak after the short commons and hard living of winter. Once, without much difficulty, I regularly rounded up a big band of them so that John Burroughs could look at them. I do not think, however, that he cared to see them as much as I did. The birds interested him more, especially a tiny owl the size of a robin, which he saw perched on the top of a tree in mid-afternoon, entirely uninfluenced by the sun and making a queer noise like a cork being pulled from a bottle. I was rather ashamed to find how much better his eyes were than mine in seeing the birds and grasping their differences. Theodore Roosevelt. The Big Stick. I saw Roosevelt a strong man who had taken early to heart Hamlet's maxim and had steadfastly practiced it. Rightly to be great is not to stir without great argument, but greatly to find quarrel in a straw when honor's at the stake. He himself summed up this part of his philosophy in a phrase which has become a proverb: "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." More than once in his later years he quoted this to me, adding that it was precisely because this or that power knew that he carried a big stick that he was enabled to speak softly with effect. William Roscoe Thayer, condensed. A Hunting Trees with John Muir, from Roosevelt's autobiography. When I first visited California, it was my good fortune to see the big trees, the sequoias, and then to travel down into the Yosemite with John Muir. Of course, of all people in the world, he was the one with whom it was best worth while thus to see the Yosemite. John Muir met me with a couple of packers and 2 mules to carry our tent, bedding, and food for a 3 days' trip. The first night was clear, and we lay down in the darkening aisles of the great sequoia grove. The majestic trunks, beautiful in their color and in symmetry, rose around us like the pillars of a mightier cathedral than ever was conceived even by the fervor of the Middle Ages. Hermit thrushes sang beautifully in the evening, and again with a burst of wonderful music at dawn. I was interested and a little surprised to find that, unlike John Burroughs, John Muir cared little for birds or bird songs and knew little about them. The hermit thrushes meant nothing to him, and the trees and the flowers and the cliffs, everything. The only birds he noticed or cared for were some that were very conspicuous, such as the water owls, always peculiar favorites of mine too. The second night we camped in a snowstorm on the edge of the canyon walls, under the spreading limbs of a grove of mighty silver fir. And next day we went down into the wonderland of the valley itself. I shall always be glad that I was in the Yosemite with John Muir, and the Yellowstone with John Burroughs. Theodore Roosevelt, condensed. The Bear Hunter's Dinner, from Roosevelt's autobiography. When wolf hunting in Texas and when bear hunting in Louisiana and Mississippi, I was not only enthralled by the sport, but also by the strange new birds and other creatures, and the trees and flowers I had not known before. By the way, there was one feast at the White House which stands above all others in my memory. This was the Bear Hunter's Dinner. I had been treated so kindly by my friends on these hunts, and they were such fine fellows, men whom I was so proud to think of as Americans, that I set my heart on having them at a hunter's dinner at the White House. One December I succeeded. There were 20 or 30 of them, all told, as good hunters, as daring riders, as first-class citizens as could be found anywhere. No finer set of guests ever sat at meat in the White House. And among other game on the table was a black bear, itself contributed by one of these same guests. Theodore Roosevelt, condensed. Hunting in Africa, from Roosevelt's autobiography. The African buffalo is undoubtedly a dangerous beast, but it happened that the few that I shot did not charge. A bull elephant, a vicious rogue which had been killing people in the native villages, did charge before being shot at. My son Kermit and I stopped it at 40 yards. Another bull elephant, also unwounded, which charged, nearly got me, as I had just fired both cartridges from my heavy double-barreled rifle, in killing the bull I was after, the first wild elephant I had ever seen. The second bull came through the thick brush to my left, like a steam plow through a light snowdrift, everything snapping before his rush, and it was so near that he could have hit me with his trunk. I slipped past him behind a tree. People have asked me how I felt on this occasion. My answer has always been that I suppose I felt as most men of like experience feel on such occasions. At such a moment, a hunter is so very busy that he has no time to get frightened. He wants to get in his cartridges and try another shot. Rhinoceros are truculent, blustering beasts, much the most stupid of all the dangerous game I know. Generally, their attitude is one of mere stupidity and bluff, but on occasions they do charge wickedly, both when wounded and when entirely unprovoked. The first I ever shot, I mortally wounded at a few rods' distance, and it charged with the utmost determination. Whereat I and my companion both fired, and, more by good luck than anything else, brought it to the ground just 13 paces from where we stood. Another rhinoceros may or may not have been meaning to charge me. I have never been certain which. It heard us, and came at us through rather thick brush, snorting and tossing its head. I am by no means sure that it had fixedly hostile intentions, and indeed, with my present experience, I think it likely that if I had not fired, it would have flinched at the last moment, and either retreated or gone by me. But I am not a rhinoceros mind-reader, and its actions were such as to warrant my regarding it as a suspicious character. I stopped it with a couple of bullets, and then followed it up and killed it. The skins of these animals which I thus killed are in the National Museum at Washington. Theodore Roosevelt, condensed. The Ever-Faithful Island. Now let us see what Theodore Roosevelt did to help establish liberty in this hemisphere. It is a far cry from the very magnificent Don Christopher Columbus, Admiral of the Ocean Sea and discoverer of the West Indies and South America, to plain Theodore Roosevelt of Oyster Bay and citizen of the United States of North America. Yet it was a very direct cry, a ringing call down through 4 centuries, a never-ceasing plea for liberty and safety. And it was plain Colonel Theodore Roosevelt who, with his Rough Riders, helped to break the last link of the chain of Spanish domination in America. Its first link was unwittingly forged by Columbus when he discovered the gold and pearls of the New World. Through the many years, Cuba, the ever-faithful island, remained loyal to Spain, while her other American possessions declared their independence, slipped from her grasp, and set up republics. But instead of taking warning from her American losses, Spain continued her policy of repression in Cuba. Then there arose Cuban patriots, among them Gomez, Maceo, and Garcia, who struggled for Cuba's freedom. There were rebellions, insurrections, and war. Great and terrible were the sufferings of the people. It is not possible here to give an account of the Cuban War for Independence, but after a terrific struggle it was finally won in 1898 with the help of our United States. Thus Spain lost her last foothold in America and withdrew from this hemisphere. Today, the island of Cuba, the ever-faithful island, and the pearl of the Antilles is a flourishing republic with a world commerce. And during the World War, the red, white, and blue single-bastarred flag of Cuba waved over a brave Cuban army, the ally of the United States. But as to Theodore Roosevelt's part in liberating the island, while he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley, we will let one of his biographers tell about it. The Colonel of the Rough Riders. In the name of humanity, in the name of civilization, in behalf of endangered American interests, which give us the right and the duty to speak and act, the war in Cuba must stop. President McKinley. Roosevelt had always felt the danger to the United States of maintaining a despicable or an inadequate navy, and from the moment he entered the Navy Department, he set about pushing the construction of the unfinished vessels and of improving the quality of the personnel. He was impelled to do this not merely by his instinct to bring whatever he undertook up to the highest standard, but also because he had a premonition that a crisis was at hand which might call the country at an instant's notice to protect itself with all the power it had. Roosevelt was impressed by the insurrection in Cuba, which kept that island in perpetual disorder. The cruel means, especially reconcentration and starvation, by which the Spaniards tried to put down the Cubans, stirred the sympathy of the Americans, and the number of those who believed that the United States ought to interfere in behalf of humanity grew from month to month. During his first year in office, Assistant Secretary Roosevelt busied himself with all the details of preparation, and all the while he watched the horizon towards Cuba, where the signs grew angrier and angrier. But the young secretary had to act with circumspection. President McKinley, desiring to keep the peace up to the very end, would not countenance any move which might seem to the Spaniards either a threat or an insult. Early in the evening of February 15, 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine, peaceably riding at her moorings in Havana Harbor, was blown up. 2 officers and 264 enlisted men were killed by the explosion and in the sinking of the ship. The next morning, the newspapers carried the report to all parts of the United States, and indeed to the whole world. A tidal wave of anger surged over this country. "That means war," was the common utterance. I doubt whether Roosevelt ever worked with greater relish than during the week succeeding the blowing up of the Maine. The Navy Department arranged in hot haste to victual the ships, to provide them with stores of coal and ammunition, to bring the crews up to their full quota by enlisting, to lay out a plan of campaign, to see the naval bases and the lines of communication, and to cooperate with the War Department in making ready the land fortifications along the shore. Having accomplished his duty as Assistant Secretary, Roosevelt resigned. He thought that he had the right to retire from that post and to gratify his long-cherished desire to take part in the actual warfare. General Alger, the Secretary of War, had a great liking for Roosevelt, offered him a commission in the army, and even the command of a regiment. This he prudently declined, having no technical military knowledge. He proposed instead that Dr. Leonard Wood should be made colonel, and that he should serve under Wood as lieutenant colonel. While Roosevelt finished his business at the Navy Department, Colonel Wood hurried to San Antonio, Texas, the rendezvous of the 1st Regiment of Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders. A call for volunteers issued by Roosevelt and endorsed by Secretary Alger spread throughout the West and Southwest, and it met with a quick response. Not even in Garibaldi's famous 1,000 was such a strange crowd gathered. It comprised cowpunchers, ranchmen, hunters, professional gamblers, and rascals of the border, sportsmen mingled with the society sports, former football players, and oarsmen, polo players, and lovers of adventure from the great eastern cities. They all had one quality in common, courage, and they were all bound together by one common bond, devotion to Theodore Roosevelt. Nearly every one of them knew him personally. Some of the Western men had hunted or ranched with him. Some of the Eastern had been with him in college or had contact with him in one of the many vicissitudes of his career. I shall not attempt to follow in detail the story of the Rough Riders, but shall touch only on those matters which referred to Roosevelt himself. Wood, having been promoted to brigadier general in command of a larger unit, Theodore Roosevelt became colonel of the regiment of Rough Riders. On July 1st and 2nd, he commanded the Rough Riders in their attack on and capture of San Juan Hill in connection with some colored troops. In this engagement, their nearest approach to a battle, the Rough Riders, who had less than 500 men in action, lost 89 in killed and wounded. Then followed a dreary life in the trenches until Santiago surrendered, and then a still more terrible experience, while they waited for Spain to give up the war. Under a killing tropical sun, receiving irregular and often damaged food, Without tent or other protection from the heat or from the rain, the Rough Riders endured for weeks the ravages of fever, climate, and privation. Finally, because of Roosevelt's insistence, the government at Washington, without loss of time, ordered the army home. The sick were transported by thousands to Montauk Point, at the eastern end of Long Island, where, in spite of the best medical care which could be improvised, large numbers of them died. But the army knew, and the American public knew, that Roosevelt had saved multitudes of lives. At Montauk Point, he was the most popular man in America. This concludes Roosevelt's career as a soldier. The experience introduced to the public those virile qualities of his with which his friends were familiar. William Roscoe Thayer arranged. The River of Doubt. Roosevelt decided to make one more trip for hunting and exploration. As he could not go to the North Pole, he said because he would be poaching on Peary's field, he selected South America. He had long wished to visit the southern continent, and invitations to speak at Rio de Janeiro and at Buenos Aires gave him an excuse for setting out. He started with the distinct purpose of collecting animal and botanical specimens, this time for the American Museum of Natural History in New York, which provided 2 trained naturalists to accompany him. His son Kermit, toughened by the previous adventure, went also. Having paid his visits and seen the civilized parts of Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, he ascended the Paraguay River and then struck across the plateau which divides its watershed from that of the tributaries of the Amazon. For he proposed to make his way through an unexplored region in central Brazil and reach the outposts of civilization on the great river. The Brazilian government had informed him that by the route he had chosen, he would meet a large river, the River of Doubt, by which he could descend to the Amazon. There were some 20 persons, including a dozen or 15 native rowers and pack-bearers in his party. They had canoes and dugouts, supplies of food for about 40 days, and a carefully chosen outfit. With high hopes, they put their craft into the water and moved downstream. But on the 4th day, they found rapids ahead, and from that time on, they were constantly obliged to land and carry their dugouts and stores round a cataract. The peril of being swept over the falls was always imminent, and as the trail, which constituted their portages, had to be cut through the matted forest, their labors were increased. In the first 11 days, they progressed only 60 miles. No one knew the distance they would have to traverse, nor how long the river would be broken by falls and cataracts before it came down into the plain of the Amazon. Some of their canoes were smashed on the rocks. 2 of the natives were drowned. They watched their provisions shrink. Contrary to their expectations, the forest had almost no animals. If they could shoot a monkey or a monster lizard, they rejoiced at having a little fresh meat. Tropical insects bit them day and night and caused inflammation and even infection. Man-eating fish lived in the river, making it dangerous for the men when they tried to cool their inflamed bodies by a swim. Most of the party had malaria and could be kept going only by large doses of quinine. Roosevelt, while in the water, wounded his leg on a rock. Inflammation set in and prevented him from walking, so that he had to be carried across the portages. The physical strength of the party, sapped by sickness and fatigue, was visibly waning. Still, the cataracts continued to impede their progress and to add terribly to their toil. The supply of food had shrunk so much that the rations were restricted and amounted to little more than enough to keep the men able to go forward slowly. Then fever attacked Roosevelt, and they had to wait for a few days because he was too weak to be moved. He besought them to leave him and hurry along to safety, because every day they delayed consumed their diminishing store of food, and they might all die of starvation. They refused to leave him, however. A change for the better in his condition came soon. They moved forward. At last, they left the rapids behind them and could drift and paddle on the unobstructed river. Roosevelt lay in the bottom of a dugout, shaded by a bit of canvas put up over his head, and too weak from sickness even to splash water on his face, for he was almost fainting from the muggy heat and the tropical sunshine. 48 days after they began their voyage on the River of Doubt, they saw a peasant, a rubber gatherer, the first human being they had met. Thenceforward they journeyed without incident. The River of Doubt flowed into the large river Madeira, where they found a steamer which took them to Manaus on the Amazon. During the homeward voyage, Roosevelt slowly recovered his strength, but he had never again the iron physique with which he had embarked the year before. The Brazilian wilderness stole away 10 years of his life. He found on his return home that some geographers and South American explorers laughed at his story of the River of Doubt. He laughed, too, at their incredulity. And presently the Brazilian government, having established the truth of his exploration and named the river after him, Rio Teodoro, his laughter prevailed. He took real satisfaction in having placed on the map of central Brazil a river 600 miles long. William Roscoe Thayer, arranged. Theodore Roosevelt. The evil men do lives after them, so does the good. With the passing of years, a man's name and fame either drift into oblivion or they are seen in their lasting proportions. You must sail 50 miles over the Ionian Sea and look back, before you can fully measure the magnitude and majesty of Mount Etna. Not otherwise, I believe, will it be with Theodore Roosevelt when the people of the future look back upon him. The blemishes due to misunderstanding will have faded away. The transient clouds will have vanished. The world will see him as he was. Those of us who knew him as the most astonishing human expression of the creative spirit we have ever seen. His manifold talents, his protean interests, his tireless energy, his thunderbolts which he did not let loose, as well as those he did, his masterful will, sheathed in self-control, like a sword in its scabbard, would have rendered him superhuman, had he not possessed other qualities which made him the best of playmates for mortals. He had humor, which raises every one to the same level. He had loyalty, which bound his friends to him for life. He had sympathy and capacity for strong, deep love. How tender he was with little children, how courteous with women. No matter whether you brought to him important things or trifles, he understood. I can think of no vicissitude in life in which Roosevelt's participation would not have been welcome. If it were danger, there could be no more valiant comrade than he. If it were sport, he was a sportsman. If it were mirth, he was a fountain of mirth, crystal pure and sparkling. But yesterday he seemed one who embodied life to the utmost. With the assured step of one whom nothing can frighten or surprise, he walked our earth as on granite. Suddenly the granite grew more unsubstantial than a bubble, and he dropped beyond sight into the eternal silence. Happy we who had such a friend. Happy the American Republic, which bore such a son. William Roscoe Thayer, condensed. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Dusty Brailsford.